Sorry, I was attending a phone call. Good morning, good afternoon, or whatever you're standing. Hi, Trevor. Hi, Jose Maria. Hi, everyone. I mean, there's so many recognizing faces, so that's super cool.
So today we are celebrating Chomsky Day, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we can always do is start without him. Not ideal, but we can start with Drivers Cooperative, which is what we had planned anyway, and hope that he's just like a minute or two late. If you could all mute your microphones, that would be fantastic. All right, well, let's just start, I guess, right? So Professor Chomsky did confirm yesterday that he will be here. This is always a sort of nerve-wracking moment when a guest is a few minutes late, but I hope this will all work out. So welcome to you all. Welcome to the participants in the New School and Mondragon course on platform co-ops in some 47 countries. Welcome to everybody who's watching. This talk is also streamed online. Welcome to the New School's Platform Cooperativism Consortium. And of course, welcome to Noam Chomsky, hopefully here in a second. So Noam Chomsky, I think, needs no introduction, so I will be very brief. His ideas have shaped the life of so many of you here in the audience. Many of you wrote me questions with life stories of how you encountered him in your own intellectual life or throughout your history. And he's known throughout the world for his scholarship and role as a public intellectual. And as an American theoretical linguist, his work revolutionized the fields of linguistics. And he wrote over 100 books. Is now a professor emeritus at MIT, university where he spent his entire career. And then, of course, he's also a political dissident, and his analysis of the influence of economic elites on US domestic politics, foreign policy, gained a worldwide following. So he's one of the most cited academics on this planet and holds 38 honorary doctoral degrees. And as I learned this morning, there's a newly described bee that was named after Noam Chomsky. So got that. But more importantly than all of this, for our context, Professor Chomsky is a great proponent of worker self-management, worker ownership, and cooperatives as steps towards a more participatory society. Right? So his work interrogates that same history of our work on the cooperative digital economy and platform co-ops in particular, which is a great segue to our first speakers, which are Ken Lewis, Alyssa Orlando, and Eric Foreman, who launched an Uber competitor in New York City, a platform cooperative called Drivers Cooperative. And for the first 7 minutes, we hear about their project, and then followed by Professor Chomsky, for whom we reserved 40 minutes. And after that, Jerome Warren will very briefly respond to Professor Chomsky, drawing on the connection between his work and platform co-ops. And we will end with an open discussion and have to close at about 10 past 10, fairly sharp. So please make sure that your microphones are muted. The hashtag for this talk is platform co-op. So let's give all our speakers a warm applause, which we can't hear, but we can at least see, right? So, all right. Okay, so I'm handing it over to Alyssa, Ken, and Eric.
Okay, I will start. Good afternoon, good morning. wherever you are, to all the participants. My name is Ken Lewis, and I'm here with my co-founders, Eric Foreman and Alisa Orlando. And we formed a drivers cooperative in New York City. And it's basically about drivers who traditionally have driven for Uber and Lyft. And we have now formed our own cooperative to compete with Uber and Lyft. Basically, in New York City, the iconic yellow cab has historically over 110 years, have many times given a middle-class life to many immigrants, to many people who have immigrated to this great city. But it has also been a story of struggle. There's been a lot of struggle from the very first year that the yellow cabs were introduced. There were in fact a lot of struggle. But in 2011, when Uber came in and the gig economy started to take over, it got even worse. Because traditionally, if you drove a yellow cab, you paid for the cab, and you would make some money. Some nights, if it was really bad, you would make no money. You would actually just make what you paid them for rent. But as bad as it was, it got worse in 2011, because then drivers had to get the means of production. They had to actually buy a car. And many of these cars were $40,000, $50,000. The cheapest one would be the Toyota Camrys, which were like $27,000, which really put a hole into working families. And so you found that you're providing the means, and at the same time, you are getting deeper into this hole with costs on top of costs. So for example, insurance is around $5,000, and that's a lot of money for a driver to actually pay. And you had the cost of the car. So when you look at all of these things, it was very difficult for drivers. And drivers kept asking, why don't we form our own co-op? Why don't we do our own? And so with this, I will hand you over to Eric.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Trevor and Iman, for hosting us. This is really very exciting. I think I met Professor Chomsky about 15 years ago at Z Media Institute. And last time I met him, it led to me spending the next 15 years of my life doing radical labor organizing. So I have no idea what's going to happen after meeting him again today. That's anyone's guess. With any luck, it's launching a worldwide alternative to Uber and Lyft under worker ownership and control. Yeah, so how did I come into the cooperative? Well, as I mentioned, last time I met Professor Chomsky, it immediately led to joining the IWW and spending the subsequent half-decade trying to unionize the US fast food industry. And I have no regrets about that. But I will say, after maybe a few years in, I had a couple of realizations. One was that I got fired, all of my friends got fired, and we did win some things, but they were relatively small. What had got me interested in labor organizing was the desire for radical change, not just reforms, although reforms are very important, but to actually change our political economic system to something maybe like the cooperative commonwealth, the old IWW vision. And I think I realized that we weren't really getting there with these traditional, even radical union campaigns. And I also realized I was hearing something from my coworkers, which is what everybody wanted: to make more money, more benefits, more respect, more rights. But people also had this dream, almost universally in the restaurant industry, of opening their own restaurant and of actually owning the place that we spend most of our waking hours. And that stuck with me. Years later, after doing a lot of other types of labor organizing projects, I ended up working at a labor nonprofit in New York City. And I heard exactly the things that Ken is saying, which is that drivers would come to me every day as a union staffer and say, why don't we create our own app? And so as a dutiful union staffer, I said, yeah, why not? Let's try to do that. That's what unions are for, right? To help workers' dreams come true. And so we got a little group together, and here we are. Our project really is more than an app. I would say we're pursuing basically three strategies. One is, yes, we are creating an app to help drivers take back the 25 to 40% of income that is extracted by Uber and Lyft. But also the problem is not only income, it's also expenses for drivers. Over half of every dollar that drivers make goes to paying for vehicles, insurance, gas, and so on. So we're also a purchasing co-op to help negotiate lower prices on those inputs and eventually hopefully extend the cooperative movement into those ancillary sectors. And the third thing is that as a co-op, at this point, we have over 2,000 members. We also are a platform for workers to come together and to speak with their own voice in the policy debates in this industry and to articulate a vision for systemic change. So we're just getting started, but we've already come pretty far. I'm very excited for what's next. And I've been very lucky to be working with Ken and Alyssa and many other drivers in the project. So I'll hand it off to Alyssa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alyssa Orlando, and I'm very grateful to be welcomed into the cooperative movement as a defector from big tech. So I actually served as head of operations for Uber in East Africa, and my tenure was short, 6 months, because I left over ethical reasons, specifically their treatment of drivers. So in that short tenure, Uber cut drivers' wages first by 35% and then by an additional 25%. And this was after we'd encouraged drivers to take out multi-year loans for tens of thousands of dollars that Ken was describing earlier. Our relationship with drivers was so bad that I literally had to wear bulletproof vests and get in bulletproof vehicles for driver meetings. So after I left the company, I pursued my MBA in the heart of Silicon Valley, where I saw firsthand the excess that was generated by investors, by founders, by executives while driving these drivers into poverty. And so when I moved to New York, I was very blessed to sync up with Eric and Ken to build this drivers cooperative, which will launch under the Co-op Ride brand. And drivers are involved through product, policy, outreach, and driver board committees to ensure that their voice is front and center in everything we build. I think something I want to highlight is this would not be possible without the support of other cooperatives. Our lead investor, Shared Capital Cooperative, is a cooperative. Our lead partner, which allows drivers to refinance their vehicles at a 3% rather than 20% interest rate, is the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, another cooperative. Our first clients were Cooperative Home Care Associates and Amalgamated Housing. So I think that really speaks to the importance of building this movement, because truly without other cooperatives, we would not exist.
Well, thank you to everybody at Drivers Cooperative. So let's see. I'm not entirely sure if Professor Chomsky has joined us by now. Professor Chomsky, if you're there, please let us know. Okay. This is an interesting performance. It feels like teaching, where you always have to improvise, right? And things like that happen. Fantastic.
Well, lucky we have two rockstar academics here, Trevor Schultz and soon to be Professor Chomsky as well.
May I ask the three speakers if the software will transport itself to the UK setting, or is it just a setup for America, North America?
That's something we haven't explored quite yet. I think that's the first we take Manhattan plan. But I think we are definitely looking at ways to provide the software to co-ops worldwide. I mean, this is we know that we need to unite and build a cooperative movement that is at the scale of global capitalism. We're still figuring out how to do that. I think some sort of coalition approach probably makes sense.
Is it possible to ask a question to the folks?
Yeah, please. Maybe we use the time like that. Huh? Yeah, if you have a question, I'm sure Professor Chomsky will come. He must. I'm not sure what's going on there.
So it's going to be a very quick question. Have you considered at all blockchain or some kind of token on the platform that could deliver extra value to the participants of the cooperative?
It's so funny. We were actually looking into this a couple days ago around creating a coin. One of the principles that we want to ensure is present is community involvement. And so our next fundraise is going to be decentralized in some way so that non-accredited investors can participate, because accredited investor laws in the United States perpetuate elites benefiting from capital. And so token offering is one of the paths that we're exploring, but definitely some sort of direct offering is in our near-term future in the next couple months.
I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if it makes sense to voice them up, or if you want to go through them itself, because there's so many and so interesting that I don't feel like I can be the one choosing. or maybe even the people that ask them, if they want to voice them up, it will be nice to see the faces of those who asked in the chat, I bet.
My question was just to hear more about how the rollout has been going since you guys have gotten started. Like, how has the process been with recruiting drivers in New York City? How has the response been from drivers? What's that been like?
Yeah, the recruitment drive has gone pretty well. I mean, we have a few thousand drivers already on the platform, and we've actually done trips for a number of the cooperatives, like we mentioned, for some of the political movements here and so on. So, and also with labor. So we're looking for ways in which this can improve. But the biggest thing is that drivers are very enthusiastic about the co-op, and many of them, we have already formed things like drivers board and the policy and committees, and drivers are working throughout the organization to make sure that this is successful.
Well, if I may, I would love to hear about the governance of the cooperative. I mean, you say that there are several thousand drivers. Are they all members? How does it work democracy-wise?
Democracy. Eric?
Sure, I could take that. Yeah. So it's very much a startup. So it's everything is under construction. So the framework we have is that we have a multi-stakeholder board, so that drivers elect the largest share of representatives. There's also representatives of essentially the office staff, which is the role that Ken and Alyssa and I are in, although Ken is also, as you see, a driver. He's driving it right now, as a matter of fact. And then we also have an independent advisor on the board, provided independent perspective on the operations. The board of directors sets the overall strategy, creates is elected by the different stakeholders in the co-op. Drivers, however, elect a board which has decision-making authority over the things that are most crucial to drivers, which one of the major problems with Uber and Lyft is the lack of due process rights. So Uber, the term that they use is deactivate, which means fire. Uber deactivates in New York City 100+ drivers every month, based on, sometimes it's literally being fired by an algorithm, because you get ratings that go below a certain level. Other times it's because customers complain, but of course customers have a sort of a conflict of interest in making complaints, because a lot of people think, oh, if you complain, you'll get a free trip. And so what I noticed working in the labor movement in this sector is that the complaints tend to follow a pattern of racial bias. And so workers of color tend to get more complaints than white workers. Immigrant workers tend to get more complaints than US-born workers, which is also because there are miscommunications around language. But the fact is, the corporate platforms, Uber and Lyft, do not provide due process rights for drivers. And frankly, I think they're actually guilty of pretty serious civil rights violations. But that's a battle for the lawyers to fight. Our platform, one of the things that makes it different is, and I shouldn't say it's for lawyers to fight, it's also a battle that we're committed to fighting. What makes our platform different is that the way we're trying to solve this problem is through due process rights, which all workers are entitled to, in my opinion, or should be entitled to. In the US, all workers are not legally entitled to due process rights, and particularly independent contractors. So serious complaints are adjudicated by an elected board of drivers in the co-op, which makes decisions about onboarding drivers, also about if there's some sort of corrective action needed or potentially expulsion. Those are decisions made by drivers who are accountable to drivers, unlike Uber and Lyft, where they're made by an algorithm or by managers who are accountable ultimately to the owners. So those are some of the main points of governance. And then we've created, I think, as Alyssa and Ken mentioned, we have committees that members are active in to work on developing the product on the app itself. So there's a direct link between the engineers and between the users. And feel free to cut me off. I'm going over here, Trevor, if our illustrious guest arrives. And a committee that's developing public policy that the co-op will be committed to. And a committee that's also working on outreach to riders, because that's really the next step for the co-op. Is in a marketplace, you need drivers and you need riders, and then the app matches people. And so our approach to recruiting riders is, it's also a social movement approach. We're building a coalition of other co-ops, unions, community organizations, which are going to commit to standing with drivers and supporting this effort to build a driver-owned alternative in the sector.
And just to add on our rider outreach strategy, a huge way that we've built up our rider list is through word of mouth. And so currently we have a wait list at drivers.coop/ride. For those of you in New York and for those of you with friends in New York, we would very much appreciate if you would spread the word.
Fantastic. So at this point, I can tell you that we have reached out. We had asked Professor Chomsky to be there 20 minutes before this event. We have emailed him. He has confirmed many times. We now reached out to him again. Haven't heard back from him. He's 92 years old. So, I mean, all kinds of things can happen, right? I'm not sure what's going on. We can hear from, I guess, on the upside, we have all of you here, which is a great opportunity maybe to hear from other projects that people are working on. We can give you a short update perhaps on what's going on with platform co-ops. These are all sort of options. If somebody feels like they have a great update, maybe Jose Marie from Mondragon is here and Anna from Mondragon is here as well. That would be a possibility, but I would also invite other people to step forward.
Trevor, you have all the questions that we all sent to Mr. Chomsky, and I'm pretty sure you have a list of 5 to 10 questions that are incredible. So what if you share them, and probably we won't match the 80 doctorates of Mr. Chomsky, but among all of us may have one honorary doctorate, and I would like to hear opinions of the rest of the people on those questions.
I think one question that is that has so many people sent their questions. I think one is having, I think Professor Chomsky has asked that question many times as well when he talks about worker self-management and worker ownership. He's often asked, how does it scale, right? So can you point to moments or locations, to territories where that has actually really worked? And he usually points to the kibbutzim in Israel, at least as an historical example, and to 1936, the Spanish Revolution, right? Where from 1936 to 1937, there was a sort of moment for a participatory society as he envisioned it. But I guess the question before us is more, how this will scale in the digital economy, right? So how will this model scale? And we have seen with probably people that are here among you that you have found ways to replicate particular models. When we look to a co-op cycle in Paris, for example, that has offered a digital infrastructure, right, to then support like some 47 cooperatives. We've seen attempts like that with Famondo in Germany. And of course, so it's in a way working and modifying the Mondragon model. And maybe Jose Marie wants to jump in here and say a little bit from the Mondragon perspective.
Thanks, Trevor. And I was thinking that maybe this momentum that Roberto, you were sharing, no? While we wait for Chomsky, maybe it's also to realize us, that maybe all of us, as the collective wisdom, we might be, maybe today, maybe the best day for creating the Chomsky platform co-op, you know? Because essentially, if he's 92, we might need to rebirth his way of thinking for the coming future. So building on that, I was actually thinking on Alisa, when you were sharing coming from Uber and then moving into driver's co-op, for sure there we see two different radical models, you know? From the point of view of a big platform, it's a monopoly. So it's aiming to conquer the world. It doesn't matter how far, it's everywhere. And we see, I remember that actually in the Platform Co-ops Now program, a lot of participants were saying, how can it be that they keep on losing money? Because the aim is not to make money, it's not to make living, it's actually to conquer and create a monopoly in the world. You know? While I believe that what you are doing with drivers, and we see that you are not the only one, we have EVA-COP, we have seen also that we have the case of Montreal, we might have drivers co-ops having in Ireland, also in Spain, in almost everywhere around the world. No? But maybe that's the great difference. How does conventional capitalist companies aim for having a platform to conquer the world? How we might be having small initiatives and how we can tie up, or maybe through the power of intercooperation, support each other to become an alternative. I don't know if this is something, while thinking in the rollout, not just about how drivers co-op might grow, but how might be drivers co-op together with all the other initiatives tied up together to intercooperate to become an alternative. No? I think in the case of Mondragon, this is something we have learned over the history. Even if Mondragon workers co-op, some of them, they are very big. The reality is among the 150 cooperatives of Mondragon, all of them, it would have closed if they were not part of an intercooperative work group, you know. So I think in that sense is over 50 years, you realize that all of the cooperatives might spend some really challenging time. But when you become into an intercooperating solid structure, then you can reach to a place that you cannot be. No? So I don't know if this might be an invitation, as Trevor was sharing in the case of COP Cycle, we see how with a simple technological solution is already replicating somehow massively. I don't know if in the strategy of this driver COP, that might be one of the solid technologically wise solution, as well as the EVA COP that was shared before. How do we play together? How do we actually intercooperate to reach to a place that none of us we can reach individually? And that will be my question. I don't know if it's for Alisa or for everyone, about how to really embrace the full power of intercooperation in Platform COP movement.
Yeah, like as I said, we wouldn't be where we were at today without intercooperative cooperation. It just wouldn't be possible. I think when we're in the same vertical, how do we collaborate across geographies is still an open question, because drivers, for example, are so focused on New York City. They're not sort of transporting all over the world. But the question is, what assets have we developed locally? In this case, a technology platform or a brand, Co-op Ride, that's recognizable by global rider base that can have value in other geographies. And so those are the two assets that we see, of a brand that's recognizable among international travelers and a tech platform that can be used in other geographies. I do want to raise the fact, though, that capital is still important. You know, we can have this cooperation, but at the end of the day, we do need capital to scale. We need capital to pay people. We need capital to invest in our technology. We need capital to market ourselves. And Greg Grodsky on this call, we're part of their accelerator right now, Start.coop, and I think is really expanding that conversation among how do you bring more investors and how do you develop new financial instruments so that cooperatives are not some cottage industry, but rather become large at-scale tech platforms that prove that a tech platform doesn't need to be owned by 12 people to be big, but you can actually have these collectively owned at-scale platforms. And that's definitely the level of ambition that we're bringing to this. We don't want this to be a cute initiative or a cute project. We want to compete in a significant way with significant market share against big platforms.
Yeah, but I also think that given the nature of how taxi services are, it's one of the advantages that Uber has been able to have. So if someone comes from London and they landed in New York, they can take a taxi automatically. So I think there is a lot of development, a lot of possibilities for cooperatives to work in a united way. The thing is that at the moment, most of the co-ops I know each have their separate technology, and that sort of thing. So there will have to be some sort of a union where people can exchange rides. So, for example, a rider from New York who uses a co-op ride and goes them to Montreal can use EVA, and so on. And if cooperatives can find that kind of synergy, it's going to help, I think, the entire movement. But it's just not there yet.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think that we already have the tool to compete on this global scale, which is, going back to one of Professor Chomsky's inspirations, the Spanish Revolution, confederation, which is locally controlled entities uniting across a large scale, which allows us to preserve democracy and local accountability, but also have an enormous reach. I think what Uber and Lyft have done, I mean, they didn't invent the taxi industry, or they didn't invent the idea of paying somebody to take you from point A to point B. What they did is they got a giant pile of capital to create a tool that allowed them to be an intermediary in that process, and then use their role as an intermediary to squeeze people on both sides by gouging customers with surge pricing, and by then exploiting drivers with extortionate commissions. And so, this is like, the idea of platform cooperative is just so logical. It's like, cut out the middleman, right? I mean, that's all it really is. And so, yes, the technology is available almost off the shelf at this point. At this point, taxi companies worldwide have spent sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop apps. For the most part, they're not quite as slick as Uber and Lyft, but they do the same thing functionally. What's really been lacking is organization and bringing these different pieces together. So that's what we're doing, focused on New York City. And I think we're very interested in talking with parallel efforts in other places. We're really committed. The New York City context, I do just want to mention, though, it is very unique. This is maybe different from some other co-ops. Our emphasis is really on solving a problem that workers face, which is of being extremely exploited. This industry employs, I don't think we mentioned this number, before the pandemic, 85,000 drivers in New York City were driving for Uber and Lyft. It's a 91% immigrant workforce. The average incomes are in the $30,000 a year range, which is not enough to really live on in New York City. It's a very hard life. And so, yeah, that we're very focused on this specific context. But, to the extent that there are drivers elsewhere struggling, we want to work with them. And we also want to work with unions, particularly with platform co-ops, where if you're already organized as a workforce, you have one of the three things that you need to take over the industry, right? Because like the rideshare industry, it's like you've got riders, which the major corporate platforms get through corporate marketing. You've got an app, and you have drivers. In this sector, unlike this sector is almost already entirely under worker ownership. If we put the app under worker ownership, it would be the only wholly worker-owned industry that I'm aware of, at least. And so we're very excited about that, and excited to see where that can go. Because I think anybody could tell you, having an organized group of tens of thousands of workers in one city, it opens up all kinds of possibilities for the kinds of things we could fight for. Just to mention a couple, our policy agenda is really up to our members. And so we don't have a defined policy agenda right now. That'll be determined through our own democratic process. But as a starting point, we have been discussing a starting point with our members. You know, some of the problems drivers face is lack of healthcare benefits, which is a problem millions of people in the United States face because we have this barbaric employer-based healthcare. I'm editorializing now. This is not the co-op's official position. We have this employer-based, let me make that more neutral, this employer-based healthcare system where if you don't have an employer, you don't have healthcare. So the problem drivers are facing could be solved with Medicare for All or the New York Health Act, which is legislation that's on the table in New York. And many of our coalition partners are already fighting for this legislation because it also helps them. So the question becomes, could we as a co-op join these broader fights that benefit the common good of the entire working class? Another issue, bathroom access. If your workplace is a vehicle driving around New York City is basically the world is a giant biological experiment of can you have a city of 8 million people with no public restroom infrastructure, which, you know, as a tourist or is like an inconvenience. But as a worker, it's like really, really a problem. So could we fight for expanding the public restroom infrastructure across New York City, which also helps everyone, tourists, other workers, the homeless, people with disabilities who have trouble finding accessible restrooms. So we're looking at all these, this is this sort of third focus area we have of what can we do as an organized group of people or a group of workers. And that, you know, those are just some ideas. The direction will be set by our members.
Can I just ask about secondary co-ops in this area? I mean, Trevor, you just put eva.coop into the chat stream. Logically, these structures develop over time when different co-ops in the same industry begin to confederate, as somebody mentioned a while ago. And we see that in agriculture all the time now. So is it a question of time? Is it a question of technology, culture? How do you get taxi co-ops to come together in a secondary co-op structure?
I just shared a whole bunch of papers from our fellows, including Morshid Manan, who also is here and posted. He wrote a paper on EVA and scaling solidarity through distributed ledgers. So I think as a strategy, I think what EVA is doing is quite interesting. So it's a social franchise, right? Which a foundation that uses the social franchise model that basically provides taxi worker cooperatives around the world with, in this case, blockchain-driven, technological platform to run their business, right? And this stays away, and I really need to emphasize this, from the sort of technological solutionism and the tech bros that celebrate blockchain as a solution to all problems related to capitalism. But there are genuinely some opportunities in that technology, which include that you can scale with relatively low cost, right? And this is, I think, what they are trying to do. So, it's a very interesting project. Also, of course, funding is an issue there too. And yeah, I mean, so Greg Brodsky was mentioned. I think Greg is here as well, right? And there are also other projects underway that I don't have to refer to right now. But I think what I see happening is that people change their attitude towards platform co-ops and cooperatives in general. So it is more a question almost of social capital, of convincing people that this is commonsensical, just so that they get the same funding like everybody else, right? And this is happening. We do see this happening. It's a process, but I think I think soon we will see platform co-ops that are already relatively successful really getting quite large funding.
Yeah, this is Greg from Start.coop. I'll just chime in since my name was mentioned twice, but I just want to go back to Jose's original question. How do we build a global ecosystem, and how do we make it so when someone steps off a plane in a different country, they can access a similar platform? I don't think this is an opportunity-sized problem. There's tremendous potential and opportunity here. I think even though some of the technology costs have gotten cheaper. It is largely still a capital problem. We meet every day entrepreneurs like Eric and Alyssa and Ken who are doing amazing things, but the reality is, and I think they would be happy to speak to us, is they're undercapitalized compared to a traditional tech startup, and certainly they're undercapitalized compared to, you know, to compete with an Uber and Lyft takes a lot of money. So even though the cost of technology has come down, I think just having the people to organize in a new city, you know, the marketing team, the driver onboarding, the tech team, that takes real money. And we need to innovate new forms of capital. We're trying to do some of that through the Accelerator program and the fund that we're creating, but we need to see more capital for these kinds of initiatives so they can not only be successful in New York City, but I think they would love to expand to additional cities. And I'm sure you guys would like to talk about this, but we need to figure out as a community ways to provide new capital so they can expand and be able to put people in those new cities and build up those teams.
Just to add into what Greg is saying is that almost every day we are getting messages from Chicago, from New Orleans, from San Francisco. When are you coming into our city? You know, some of these drivers are actually regular people on our monthly meeting, on our monthly Zooms. Many of them volunteered, but it's, as Greg is saying, we need that capital injection, and cooperatives really have to work this out in terms of how we can expand.
Yeah, like our UX design work is led by a driver from Portland. A lot of our outreach is done by a driver in Texas. So in terms of workers coming together, we really do have that geographic reach. But in order for launch to be successful in those new cities, we need, yes, that cooperation, but also that capital.
Which is really...
And maybe building one further to move in what Greg was sharing, you know, I do believe, and even in the case of Mondragon, that we have got quite large cooperatives, sometimes I believe that we still have global cooperatives with a local mindset. So what I think we cannot accept is that in this movement, although we come from a local community, at least the leaders of this conception, we need to think global, you know, in a multi-local way. Otherwise, even if I fully agree with Greg that we do not have enough capital in the cooperative world and we need to find ways to make it happen as he's dealing with the startup co, we do need also to think global to really give a perspective that through inter-cooperation, we are able to actually address global scale, you know. In that moment, I think that if we are able to find out how to do that properly, then I think we can become an alternative. But otherwise, we might be, in the case of Mondragon, there was one case, the case of Iriza. Iriza, they do assembling buses, and it's I would say in its sector, a world leader. Actually, recently has been the one who has a self-driving bus running in Spain, the first one, I think, ever. In their case, when they were really thinking on product, in innovation in product, they realized we cannot be sustainable if we invest enough in developing the best product, only thinking in the Spanish market. Actually, 20 years ago, when they think, come on, we need to open up globally to have enough market possibilities of addressing, then we have the possibility of investing what is needed. So I do believe that there we have the challenge of how do we stretch the platform movement to think global and to play together in that sense. And then for sure to assure that we convince and we get funds of investment for those global interconnected projects. No? I don't know if this makes any sense.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity. And I think so many of us feel a gap between where the economy is now and what we want the economy to be, right? And I think we're asking a lot of our, you know, very scrappy and very creative entrepreneurs like the team on this call to innovate against these global competitors. But we do have to try to figure out, you know, new ways of financing them. And I think that the team is hopefully going to be doing some sort of crowdfunding or fundraising thing later this year. You know, and so I think as a reminder, you know, Amazon just started with books for the first, you know, whatever was 7 years, right? Uber probably just started in, you know, one city for the first few years. So I think each team sort of has to, I think, Jose, you're right. Like but they need to start where they are, like, and really get that market down. And then hopefully find the outside capital to, anyway, capital is a thing that if people want to talk about further, we could talk about some of the innovations we're seeing. And, Alyssa and Eric and Ken, I'm curious for you guys to just share what else would help you guys right now. I know you guys are on the upswing, you're launching soon. Is there anything else you could ask of this community that's assembled in terms of, you know, connections you're looking for or ways people can help spread the message?
Well, I think there's maybe two very concrete things. And I did just want to say just a few quick things about capital. One is if you want to help capitalize the cooperative, you can in fact do that from the safety of your own computer. I'll put, if you go to our website, you can, here, I'll put the link in the chat. It's drivers.coop. We got that great .coop real estate. And you can click on the button on the upper right to donate. That of course is a donation. We're looking for ways to do crowdfunding investment, but there's a lot of paperwork and you have to pay a lot of lawyers to do that. So, but you can donate now if this is a problem that you're passionate about solving. The other thing is that we, as I mentioned, we're building a coalition of riders. And so I'll put, if you want to join that coalition, it's essentially a wait list for the app launch. You can sign up online at drivers.coop/ride. And just one thing I wanted to say about capital, you know, when I was a fast food worker and trying to unionize these fast food shops I worked at, most of my coworkers were terrified of the idea of starting a union, but they all wanted to start their own restaurant. But the thing is, like, coming from, I don't know, as like my favorite political economist would tell you, the reason that you're a worker is because you don't have capital. It's just a definitional problem. And so but it's a problem that we're also able to solve. And so I think that it's not quite zero sum. And I think it's a problem we are solving. Like we've gotten investment capital from the co-op movement, from a credit union, from Shared Capital Cooperative, which is essentially a credit union of cooperatives, from the Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, and then crowdfunding from hundreds and hundreds of people. That has allowed us to assemble the resources now where we can get to this next level, where we'll need to raise more capital. So I think that personally, I feel very inspired because I think when I was a fast food worker, I realized that for basically what amounts to the mortgage on a single family house in the United States, you could start your own Jimmy John's franchise or fast food franchise, but even that was out of reach for workers who were making $7.25 an hour, as I was at the time. I think that the co-op movement has coalesced to the point now where if you have an idea, there are institutions out there in this movement that will invest. You have to show them that it's a really good idea, and you're gonna have to work really, really hard. And there's all kinds of barriers, particularly for co-ops that value involving workers who are on the front lines in these industries, because you have to, people are working in this industry 60 hours a week. But we're getting there, you know, and I think so I guess I have a message of optimism and hope. And we're getting there thanks to a lot of the people in this room. Thanks to Trevor, thanks to Greg, thanks to Wilma, who's on here somewhere. And many others. I can't see all the participants, but at any time we're on one of these, I always see people who've helped us in some way. But I'm sure there's other things that I'm forgetting about that my colleagues might be able to mention.
I also have a message of optimism and hope. And I've just heard from someone, from Natasha Warner at the University of Arizona. I've been desperately writing and calling various staff there. You know, these are the people who are usually disregarded, as executive assistants, the secretaries of the world, but they are very kind people. And she has just texted his assistant, and we can just hope that the word will get through the grapevine and that Chomsky will appear shortly. My suspicion is that he's mixed up the time. I had a call with Richard Wilkinson, also famous British author.
Jerome, we provided all.
He was an hour late for that call. So, you know, old people and, you know, time, sometimes it's, yeah, so.
Jerome, we provided all the times for him in his local time zone. So that, but yeah, so I think it's a great opportunity, like Isabel said, to be together. Maybe he will still join, maybe not. Let's just assume that he will not join, and just maybe enjoy a few more moments together. So I would also say, just like as you know, there are many initiatives like Start.coop, right? There's Incubator.coop in Australia. There's Andreas Arnold here from Platform Co-ops Germany. There's Hera from Indonesia here, right? So Mondragon is working in Spain and in many countries around the world to support this as well. There's Lega Co-op in Italy, really committing itself to this. And here comes Noam Chomsky. Okay, it worked out after all. Okay, so here we go. Now I just need to see him. Welcome, Professor Chomsky.
I think you have to unmute yourself, Professor Chomsky.
I don't know.
I saw the profile joining us, but now I don't see him. Where is he?
What is this called now, Chomsky?
This really gives a new definition to the word suspense. Oh, here's Professor Noam Chomsky. Hello. Now we can see you. We have been in great anticipation of your arrival. So welcome, everybody, to Professor Chomsky. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, wonderful. Well, welcome, welcome. We're so glad to see you. We already started with an introduction by the Drivers Cooperative, which is a digital cooperative in New York City that is competing with Uber. And we have talked about your own commitment to worker self-management and worker ownership and to cooperatives, right, as a way to a more participatory society. So we were just curious to see where you see sort of, I guess, historical references for this work, that all these people here, there are several hundred people in this call waiting to hear from you, and to make these connections, I think would be a really helpful step for us.
Okay. So you ready for me to get started?
Yeah, please, just
okay.
Feel free. Yeah.
Glad to be with you. Should make it clear that I am in no position to discuss the actual work that the groups are doing on shared economy. I would keep to some general observations that I think it's useful to keep in mind about the background, history, development, current prospects for such ideas. So let's start by Antonio Gramsci writing from Mussolini's prison cell, labor activist whose work was mostly involved in worker-owned, self-managed workers' enterprises, left social theorist. He discussed how societies tend to develop ideas and beliefs that reflect and support the prevailing structure of power, creating a framework of beliefs and attitudes that becomes what he called hegemonic common sense, something we don't question. We just take for granted, like the air we breathe. Now that tendency has, of course, been recognized before, was a major thesis of Marxist thought, had much deeper origins in modern thought. One of the most interesting is David Hume, the great philosopher David Hume, 18th century. He wrote one of the first major works in what we now call political science, is on the first principles of government. And he opens it in the first paragraph by writing that, I'll quote him, says, he finds nothing more surprising than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder has brought about, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic, most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. It's far more significant in the countries that are most free and most popular, where the art of what Walter Lippmann called manufacturing consent has reached its apogee, its most sophisticated application, since direct force is less available. Well, I think all of these thoughts merit careful attention. It's very useful to consider what we take for granted as unquestionable common sense, what we consent to without reflection, not just what we consent to, but what we often go on to regard as the highest goal of life. So in today's world, one of the highest goals in life is having a job. The best advice that one can give to a young person is to prepare to find employment. That is, to prepare to spend your waking life in servitude to a master. For many, that means subordination to discipline that is far more extreme than in a totalitarian state. So Stalin, for example, had enormous control over his subjects, but he didn't have enough control to tell them that at 3 p.m. you can take a bathroom break for a couple of minutes. Here's the clothes you have to wear all day. Here's the way you have to behave when an unpleasant customer comes in. And in general, this is how you have to live your life for most of your waking hours, down to the last detail. That's what's called having a job. Well, all of this is quite apart from the ingenious means that have been developed and devised over the years to control the lives of the subjects, from Taylorism, its origins back in the 19th century, control every motion that a working person makes, up to the devices that are being made available by modern technology. Managers might keep an eye on the workforce, and now it is the all-seeing eye of some remote computer. The major delivery services, UPS and others, now describe how they are increasing efficiency thanks to the new techniques of surveillance. Means fewer drivers achieving more and faster delivery. The method of the new devices allow remote managers to find out if the driver stopped for a cup of coffee or backed up when he shouldn't have done it, so he can get an instant notice of a demerit. Another one and you're fired. Or can find out in seconds whether an Amazon warehouse worker takes the wrong path and wastes 2 seconds, let alone stops to talk to somebody. Demerit, next one, you're gone. And innumerable other examples that are all too familiar, not only in the precarious gig economy, but in one way or another through the whole system of renting oneself for survival, holding a job, one of the highest goals in life. Well, that may be hegemonic common sense today, but it certainly has not been in the past. From classical antiquity right through the 19th century. The idea of being dependent on the will and the domination of others was considered an intolerable attack on elementary rights and human dignity. The hegemonic common sense of today is very recent development, matter worth pondering. In fact, all of this seemed so obviously correct that dependence on a master is intolerable, so obviously correct that it was a slogan of Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, which regarded wage labor as differing from slavery only insofar as it was a temporary state until the person could gain freedom. But actually the most lively and eloquent and incisive condemnations and critiques were in the very vibrant labor press of the early Industrial Revolution, written by working people, including what were called the factory girls, young women from the farms who were driven to the mills in the rising industrial system. Their writings are very much worth reading. They are available often in archival forms. The Journal of the Knights of Labor, the great multinational, multiracial union of the 19th century America, held this main slogan that when a man is placed in a position where he is compelled to provide the benefits of his labor to another, he is in a condition of slavery. That was the standard assumption of working people, men and women, through the early years of the Industrial Revolution, right through the 19th century. One of the most articulate contributors to the working class protests against the reinstitution of a form of slavery and the rising industrial system, one of the most eloquent voices was an itinerant mechanic, Thomas Skidmore. Didn't have any formal education, but he was highly educated, like many others at the time. He developed a serious critique of wage slavery, founding it on the labor theory of value as it had been developed by the classic economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, with whose work he and others were familiar. And on that foundation, he defined slavery as, in his words, being compelled to labor while the proceeds of that labor is taken by others, and went on to argue at length that no matter how property rights are attained, they are illegitimate if they're used to make some dependent on others, allowing some to appropriate to themselves the labor of others. The General Labor Press extended and deepened these ideas. It was vocal and articulate. It condemned, quoting, the blasting influence of monarchical principles on democratic soil, referring to the wage contract. Workers recognized that this assault on basic human rights will not be overcome until those who, in their words, those who work in the mills will own them, and sovereignty will return to producers. Then, quoting, working people will no longer be menials or the humble subjects of a foreign despot, an absentee owner, so that they will be slaves in the strictest sense of the word, who toil for their masters. Rather, they will regain their citizens as free, their rights as status as free American citizens. It was recognized that the Industrial Revolution had introduced a crucial shift from price to wage. So when an artisan sells a product for a price, he retains his person. When he rents himself to a master, he sells himself. He loses his dignity as a person, becomes a wage slave in the terminology of the time. All of these ideas were very much alive, of course, after the formal abolition of chattel slavery. I stress formal because it was quickly reinstituted in 1877 as a new form of slavery, which lasted pretty much into the 1930s and was the basis for the second industrial revolution in the South. Legacy still remains. But in that context, the notion of wage slavery became very prominent. How is it different from chattel slavery? Well, the idea that productive enterprise should be owned by the workforce was pretty common coin all the way through the 19th century, and not just by Karl Marx and other left intellectuals, but also by the major exponents of classical liberalism. The idea was part of the classical liberal tradition of the time. One person who's brought this out eloquently in his recent work is David Ellerman in his studies of what he calls neo-abolitionism. He mentions John Stuart Mill, the most prominent classical liberal figure of the 19th century, one of the great modern intellectuals. Mill argued that, I'm quoting him, the form of association which, if mankind continues to improve, must be expected to predominate is the association of the laborers themselves on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital with which they carry on their operations, working under managers electable and removable by themselves. In other words, democracy in the workplace. That's the form of association to which the human species will ascend if it continues to improve, according to the doctrines of 19th century classical liberalism. It's a concept that has very solid roots in the ideas that animated classical liberal thought from its earliest days, from John Locke, Adam Smith, and others. Some of the most eloquent and forceful development of these ideas was in the writings of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was one of the founding figures of classical liberalism, also the founder of the modern research university. His words are worth thinking about, reading and thinking about carefully. They're far-reaching in their import. Humboldt held that freedom is the necessary condition without which even the most soul-satisfying occupation cannot produce any wholesome effects. Whatever task is not chosen by a man's free will, whatever constrains or even guides him, does not become part of his nature. It remains forever alien to him. If he performs it, he does it not with true humane energy, but with mere mechanical skill. Ideas, incidentally, which Humboldt also applied to the educational system in a manner which follows quite directly from the same thoughts. He went on to say that under the condition of freedom from external control, all peasants and craftsmen can be transformed into artists. That is, people who love their craft for its own sake and refine it with their self-guided energy and inventiveness, and who in so doing cultivate their own intellectual energies, ennoble their character, and increase their enjoyments. This way, humanity would be ennobled by the very things which now, however beautiful they might be, degraded. This urge for self-realization is man's basic human need from childhood, as distinct from mere animal needs. One who fails to recognize this ought justly to be suspected of failing to regard human nature as what it is and of wishing to turn men into machines. To determine whether the fundamental human rights are being honored, we must consider not just what a person does, but the conditions under which he does it, whether it is done under external control or spontaneously to fulfill a human need. If an artisan produces a beautiful work on command, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, an instrument in the hands of others, not a free human being. Adam Smith developed a very sharp critique of division of labor, not what he's famous for. In fact, it's interesting that in the bicentennial edition, the Chicago edition of Adam Smith, the scholarly edition, there isn't even an index entry for Smith's sharp critique of division of labor, but it's there and it's founded on the same principles. Smith argued that a person who performs the same task over and over on command will become as stupid and ignorant as a human being can be, an outcome that must be prevented by government action in any civilized society. Only work that is freely undertaken, using and enhancing one's own creative powers, is an acceptable social condition. And that's the foundation of classical liberal thought. It's a very short step from these principles to the idea of control of all institutions, all communities, within a framework of free association, federal free organization through agreed voluntary associations. Now, that's the general style of very wide range of thought, including the main socialist traditions, the left anti-Bolshevik Marxists, a much current activist work today of people seeking to gain control over their own lives and fate. There's a proliferation of worker-owned enterprises in the old Rust Belt in the United States, deindustrialized by neoliberal globalization in the interests of short-term profits of bankers and investors, spread of cooperatives, localization of agriculture, and many other initiatives of mutual aid, with the long-term goal of creating the kind of cooperative commonwealth that was the explicit ideal of working people and farmers through the early industrial revolution. Labor activists of the 19th century, late 19th century, warned of what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. There have been massive efforts to instill this pernicious doctrine in people's heads. The huge advertising and marketing industries spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year to achieve this goal. Much of intellectual culture and education is directed to it, and all quite consciously. If you read the press of the highly class-conscious business world, it warns of what they call, quoting it now, the need to engage in the everlasting battle for the minds of men, to indoctrinate people with the capitalist story so deeply that they repeat it reflexively without thought. It should become common sense, mere common sense, to extol the merits of subordinating oneself to a master for one's waking life, to live a life of servitude to some foreign force. All of this was well understood by working people in the 19th century. In fact, workers in late 19th century New York warned that a day might come when wage slaves will so far forget what is due to manhood as to glory in a system forced on them by their necessity and in opposition to their feelings of independence and self-respect. They expressed their hope that that day would be far distant. In Gramscian terminology, they hoped to be able to block the efforts to instill a new hegemonic common sense in which workers would not only accept, but in fact glory in a system that turns them into menial and humble servants, as they put it, wage slaves under tight control, abandoning their independence for the larger part of their lives. In Hume's earlier terms, they hoped to prevent the imposition of the consent of the government that permits the masters to rule, whether in state or private government. Same ideas, I should mention, relate to the general intellectual culture, not just the submission to a master for most of one's life. It's a topic that George Orwell wrote about it in Suppressed Work that you probably didn't read. Everyone has read Animal Farm, of course, but not very many people have read the introduction to Animal Farm, which was not published. It was discovered in Orwell's papers 30 years later. The introduction to Animal Farm is directed to the people of England. It says, this work is, of course, a satire on the totalitarian enemy, but the people of England shouldn't feel too self-righteous about it, because in free England, in his words, ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. His title of his work is called Literary Censorship in England, in Free England, and he gives a number of examples and a few sentences of explanation. And one reason, he says, is that the press is owned by wealthy men who have every reason to want certain ideas to be suppressed. But the second and more interesting idea is essentially Gramscian. If you've had a good education, you've gone to Oxford and Cambridge, you have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. We can add wouldn't do to think. That's manufacture of consent in the modern sophisticated term, the foundations of the liberal theories of democracy by Walter Lippmann, Harold Lasswell, founder of modern political science, all good Roosevelt, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals whose view was very much like that of the men who called themselves the men of best quality in the 18th century, the rabble, 17th century. The rabble have to be suppressed. It's none of their business to become involved in public affairs. They're too stupid and ignorant, as Reinhold Niebuhr put it. Therefore, they must, in his words, be controlled by necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications, as Lippmann put it in his progressive essays on democracy, people have a function, namely to be spectators, but not participants. Their function is to show up every couple of years, push a lever to pick one or another of us, the responsible men, who have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. That's liberal, progressive, democratic theory in the modern period, traces far back to the suppression of the common people in the English Revolution, and in fact to the US Constitution, which was, the Constitution, of course, was written by a small number of wealthy men, mostly slave owners, who nobody else could spend a summer in Philadelphia in those days. And the Constitution was, actually its essence is captured in the title of the leading scholarly work on the Constitutional Convention, Michael Klarman's book, Harvard professor, called The Framers' Coup, a coup against democracy. The leading framer, James Madison, understood that the public had to be kept out of governing the country. They had to stop the threat of democracy that the public wanted. Therefore, there was a coup carried out by the framers to ensure that democracy wouldn't function. In Madison's design, power was primarily in the Senate, unelected, not elected till 20th century, picked by elites. The Senate was to represent, as Madison put it, the wealth of the nation, those who recognize the rights of property owners and who understand that a prime goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's the essence of the Constitution. In Madison's defense, we should say that he was basically pre-capitalist in mentality. He assumed that the wealthy men would be the Roman gentlemen in the mythology of the day, dedicated to labor for the common good with no self-interest. Should say that Adam Smith at the same time had a much sharper eye. Smith described the existing situation in words that we can easily translate into today. He wrote in Wealth of Nations, 1776, that the merchants and manufacturers of England are the masters of mankind, and they use their power to ensure they become the principal architects of government policy, which they design to ensure that their own interests are very well attended to, no matter how grievous the impact on others, including the people of England, but of primarily those who are subject to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, referring particularly to the British destruction and deindustrialization of India at the time. That was Adam Smith. Again, the terms are easily translatable today. I should say that it didn't take long for Madison to recognize the same truisms. In 1792, he wrote an eloquent letter to his friend Thomas Jefferson, bemoaning the collapse of the experiment, quasi-democratic experiment that he had designed. He said, power has been taken over by the stock jobbers, Wall Street in our terms. The stock jobbers have become the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming government by their combinations and benefiting from government's largesse. Very easy to translate that into 21st century terms. Many things in one form or another remain constant, including bitter class war waged by the highly class conscious property owning capitalist classes. Well, in sharp, going back to the 19th century, in very sharp reaction to these efforts to impose submission to the masters, there were very important rising movements of working people, radical farmers in what was then, of course, largely an agrarian society. The farmers' movements began in Texas, moved up to Kansas, Oklahoma, Midwest generally, included most of the farmers, that's most of the working population. This is what was called the populist movement, not populism in the modern sense. This is traditional populism, radical democratic populism. They were dedicated to solidarity, mutual aid. They created the most significant democratic movement in American history. Farmers developed cooperative institutions, cooperative banks, support programs, distribution programs. They wanted to escape the control of Northeastern bankers and the capitalist controlled distributors. They had a good deal of success. Also, at the same time, that was true of workers in the industrializing Northeast. So in industrial areas of Western Pennsylvania, cities were run by democratically elected working class groups, instituted policies leading towards the cooperative commonwealth that was their joint ideal. There were efforts to link the major labor movement, the Knights of Labor, and the radical farmers of the populist movements. And they were defeated, mostly by force and violence. The United States has an unusually violent labor history, much worse than comparable countries. It's to a very large extent a business-run society with a very highly class-conscious business class. But the battle is never over. There are setbacks, there's violent repression, intense efforts to beat these ideas of independence and dignity and self-respect out of people's minds, but the struggle goes on constantly. In the United States, it's been very striking in recent years. During the recent neoliberal years, escalating under Reagan, independent farming has been decimated. US agricultural production has tripled since World War II. The number of independent farms has shrunk by 2/3. The size of remaining farms has tripled as highly subsidized agribusiness has displaced independent farms, greatly harming the ecosystem, maybe leading to species suicide, as well as harming, of course, individual lives. Right now in India, the same is happening on a very dramatic scale. Since the neoliberal reforms of the 1990s, over 350,000 peasant suicides have been officially recorded. Nobody knows how many there actually are. Right now, the agricultural workers of India, mass of the population, are fighting for survival on the streets of New Delhi against the extension of these destructive measures. In general, a wide variety of attacks on the general population have been launched under the cover of neoliberal reforms. It's quite a remarkable scale and with very severe effects. Take the United States, our prime concern. The Rand Corporation, quasi-governmental, highly respected, recently conducted a study of what they call the transfer of wealth from the middle class and the working class to the very top of the population. Their technique, it's the lower 90% of the population to the very top. They estimated the transfer during the 40 years of the escalation of neoliberalism under Reagan. Transfer, incidentally, is a euphemism for robbery of workers in the middle class. They estimate the robbery in 40 years as $47 trillion. That's not small change. It's also a very serious underestimate. Following good neoliberal doctrine, Reagan opened the spigot for other forms of robbery. One of the main ones is tax havens. Previously, they were illegal, and the laws were enforced by an activist Treasury Department. Estimates of the robbery since Reagan run to an additional tens of trillions of dollars. Fair guess is that maybe something like 70 or 80 trillion dollars has been robbed from the working class and the middle class, put into the hands of the ultra rich during the 40 years of neoliberal reform. The Treasury Department used to have investigative departments which could enforce the law. Under the neoliberal programs, which incidentally are bipartisan, Clinton made a huge contribution to them. The investigative branch of the departments of the Treasury have been severely underfunded for good reasons. That means they can barely examine the rich. They don't even take the trouble to do it. You can't work your way through the tax lawyers, corporate law firms that have developed complex techniques of evasion. So they don't examine the rich, which opens the door for additional forms of robbery with huge numbers, but we can only guess them. And meanwhile, while this has been happening, real wages for non-supervisory workers, non-managers, have actually declined. Purchasing power has declined. That sharply reverses the pattern of the period of so-called regimented capitalism, the New Deal and subsequent years, during that time, wages tracked productivity. During the 40 neoliberal regression, years of neoliberal regression, inequality has, of course, soared. Now, the top 0.1% of the population, not 1%, 0.1%, have doubled their wealth from 10% to a colossal 20% of total wealth. Studies by Economic Policy Institute and others show that inequality is very closely correlated with unionization. The unions rise and fall, inequality falls and rises in tandem. Remarkably close correlation. The mechanisms are quite clear. Reagan and Thatcher knew what they were doing when they launched the global neoliberal assault with a major attack on unions. It's necessary, of course, to destroy any means for working people to defend themselves against the state corporate attack. By now, mainstream economists like Lawrence Summers reached the same conclusion, that the decline of unionization is the major, if not the major factor in the growing inequality. During these years, strike action has sharply declined. It's practically declined practically to zero in recent years. It's a very good measure of the loss of defense against the assault. Precarity has sharply increased. By now, a majority of working people report that they live from paycheck to paycheck, no reserves in case of some emergency. democracy, of course, declines with concentration of private power. Similar developments have taken place in much of the world. Some respects it's even worse in Europe than here. Structure of the European Union has transferred decision-making from national governments, which are to some extent responsive to their own populations, transferred from there to an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels, the famous Troika, unelected European Commission, IMF, major banks, mostly German, French banks. Of course, you can guess what kind of policies follow, including the highly destructive austerity policies. We're now seeing other examples in the incapacity to deal with the epidemic. This has deeply embittered the population. It's led to anger, resentment, breakdown, collapse of the traditional parties. They barely exist anymore. The rise of fertile terrain for the rise of demagogues of the Trump style, comparable ones in Europe, Modi in India, others who can use the opportunity, the breakdown, to impose deeply authoritarian and destructive policies. Well, that's the great achievement of the neoliberal reforms. There have been periods of regression before. They've been overcome. The tasks are far more urgent now than they were in the past. We're in an unusual period right now. For the first time in history, we're facing threats even to survival of organized human life, and not in the distant future. The increasing threats of global warming and nuclear war should be too familiar to require any review. The threats can be met. Feasible solutions are known to every one of the dire problems that humans face. What is not known is whether human intelligence and human will are capable of grasping the opportunities that exist. Now, they're not going to exist for long. If the opportunities are grasped and pursued, the path is open to a much better world, a world in which ideals of freedom and independence that prevailed for millennia can be revived, carried forward, now not restricted to some, as in the past, but encompassing all. They may be suppressed now, these ideals, but not very deeply, I expect. We may recall Karl Marx's image of the old mole who keeps burrowing below the surface, not very far from the surface, then comes to the surface when the proper circumstances arise and an engaged public can break the fetters of submission and passive conformity. Can happen again. That's the hope for the future. It's in your hands. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I think I'm handing it to Jerome Warren, who had prepared a very short response.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Thank you very much, Trevor, and thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for your openness to being here. I was the annoying random citizen who wrote you to wish you well on your birthday and just sort of mentioned this as an aside, and you very graciously responded in the affirmative that you were interested in speaking with us. So thank you for your talk. I have written out, Professor Chomsky, would you have a moment to respond to a general question on?
Not too much. I have another talk coming up in 20 minutes, so a little bit.
Well, I was going to ask you, I'm in the process of starting a Rudolf Rocker Center in Rudolf Rocker's hometown of Mainz, Germany, to deal with the issues that we've talked about here. And I was going to see if I could get a response from you on the connection between Rudolf Rocker, who I know has made an impact on your life and thinking, and the movement of cooperative values, and the movement for platform cooperativism, and generally notions of solidarity, advocacy for immigrant labor, and a wide palette of other issues. If I could just get you to respond to that.
That's what's needed, forming of such organizations and communities. Bits and pieces are happening all over the world. If they can coalesce, come together, form a unified movement, very much like what the radical farmers and radical workers in the 19th century sought to do, came close to doing, but not quite. We can proceed now with many victories won at a higher level to try to achieve the same thing. It's not going to be very easy, plenty of barriers, but there's no clear reason why they can't be overcome.
There was one really great question that was asked earlier on by Motir Rahman, and he asked about the political franchise, why there is no focus on a notion of an economic franchise. So we have the notion of the political suffrage. We are all allowed to vote. You mentioned, Walter Lippmann and this notion of, we go every 4 years. Why does this notion of democracy not extend to an economic franchise and extend it to the workplace?
That's one of the techniques of imposing the kind of consent that Hume was talking about. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. There are private governments, there's a public government. The private governments happen to be almost purely totalitarian. Private corporation is about as close to pure totalitarianism as humans have ever devised. Decisions are made at the very top, major corporations, usually by bankers and investors in Chicago and New York, no particular interest in the enterprise, except making money out of it. That's where the top decisions are made. They're transferred down to various levels of management, down through the levels of management where each follows the orders given from above. At the very bottom, you have people who have the choice between starving and renting themselves for survival. It's called having a job. Hard to imagine a more totalitarian structure. Of course they are. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't have democratic control of these institutions, as had been advocated way back, one or another form, back to classical Rome, Cicero, through the days of early and late classical liberalism, through the working class movements of the 19th century, through the left movements of the 20th century, on to the developments that are taking place in scattered but significant ways throughout much of the world. Yes, you should have, we should not accept to submit ourselves to the concept that only public government should have a democratic franchise. And we should recognize the wisdom of what Adam Smith could perceive in the very early days of modern capitalism, what James Madison came to perceive a few years later, that in Madison's words, the financial institutions have now become the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming government by their power and combinations, becoming what Smith called the principal architects of government policy, and benefiting from the largesses of government. The talk about government is the problem, not the solution, the Reagan slogan, is pure farce. The the entire network of private totalitarian capital relies crucially on public largesse. IMF did a study recently, a couple of years ago, of the top American banks, half a dozen top American banks, trying to estimate the source of their profits, came almost entirely from the implicit government insurance policy. Government has an insurance policy for the big banks. In the common term for it is too big to fail. Means you've got a guaranteed insurance policy. That means not only the bailouts, that's only part of it, but the ability to get cheap credit, to take risky, unprofitable initiatives, because if they go wrong, the public will happily bail you out. All of this amounts to huge amounts of money. IMF estimate was Bloomberg News tried to estimate it based on the IMF analysis. They estimated maybe $80 billion a year of direct subsidy simply through the implicit insurance policy. That's in part from the enormous subsidies to agribusiness, to the energy system, and so on. So yes, they overwhelm the government with their combinations and they benefit from its largesse. No reason why any of this should persist. We consent to it because it's become common sense. If you have a good education, as Orwell said, you understand that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say, like what we've just been saying. But there's no reason to accept any of this. It's never been accepted by the mass of the population before. They've always risen up and opposed it, led to many advances. No reason why that can't happen now. So I think the answer to your question is you're absolutely right. We shouldn't accept it.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Luis. I want to be respectful of Professor Chomsky's time, and I think he should also have some rest before he gives his next talk. I think many of us have been in this position and know how exhausting it is. We're really extremely appreciative of your time, Professor Chomsky. Thank you to Jerome for helping to make this happen. Thank you to everybody at Drivers Cooperative, and thank you for everybody who for such a long time stayed with us initially for our discussion. And we will post the recording of this talk through social media and on our website, so you can find this on archive.org. And so I want to thank everybody, also Aman, Badia, and I know that there are many people who will be disappointed, as I can see from your faces, that you don't get to ask this question again, but I think the respect for the speaker is also important. So thank you, Professor Chomsky, and thank you to all of you for joining this event. And we hope to see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, if any of you want to stay, I think we can stay, but I think it was important to allow Professor Chomsky to move on to his next obligation, which I'm sure he has one after the other.
Yes, I'm also open to staying for a few minutes and maybe talking in the group here, seeing who's still interested in sharing ideas. There were a lot of interesting contributions in the chat. I had something prepared to read out, but I thought instead of talking, hearing me speak, maybe just to have at least one or two responses from Chomsky might be desirable.
Well, I think it was sort of like, for me, it was a perfect, primer on why ownership matters, right, in a way. Right, like that's the sort of foundation of worker ownership and, participatory democracy. Yeah, please.
Well, I'm introducing myself. My name is Giulio Ecchi. I'm an economist in Italy, working on, let's say, theory of the firm and participatory form of firms, among which cooperatives. And I wanted just to share with the participant the fact that I'm a member of a network in Europe of about 20-25 multidisciplinary scholars on the topic of democracy in organizations. We've been meeting since more than over a year. The organizer is a colleague of political philosophy at CNRS France, Paris. And we are running seminars and webinars. We have one this week about various aspects from multidisciplinary perspective on this issue of democracy in organization, among which cooperatives. So I just want to share this point because I found obviously the presentation by Professor Chomsky very interesting, but also very interesting the topic, which is platform co-ops, because obviously mixes a very prominent issue in economics, that one of the economics of platform, with the issue of cooperatives. So the Italian experience is interesting, but I would say I just want to share this point, the fact that I think we should try to create also, let's say, intercontinental or interdisciplinary discussion and fora where more people are aware of the results of research in various fields. Because I think, as also Professor Chomsky meant at the beginning, the risk is that the hegemony of a very narrow view of economics and society takes out the space for the discussion of variety, both in economics and all the other disciplines. That's the only wanted to just thank you, Professor Schultz, for this opportunity, but in general, all the participants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have, of course, also the Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy at the New School, which focuses very much on these topics. And we also started an expert working group, a very small one, on the platform economy and platform co-ops in particular.
Yes, in fact, I've spoken with Vera Zamagni about the possibility of possibly joining your group. So I will be in touch directly with you, possibly for this opportunity, if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic.
Trevor, I don't know if it makes sense, as we are still around 80 people in the call, that maybe we can just try to share what might be the main insight that each one is getting. And either we can say it loud, maybe just few, but maybe we can write, no? As a way of like, which will be the echo or the insight we get from Chomsky works. Make sense? And this way we can put it in the chat, or also as we stay a little bit longer. Make sense or not? How you see?
We could, the chat is sort of time limited to our conversation. What we could do is, I mean, I don't know, Aman, are you still here? I don't see you right now.
Yeah,
we created a document initially that we shared in the waiting room. I don't know if people were using this, where we hoped people could share questions. So we could, post this document maybe one more time in the chat, and then we could use this document, which then people could also use once this is closed down.
You can also save the chat, maybe.
Yeah, of course. No, of course we're saving the chat. Yeah, yeah, we will do that. Just in a more general term, we are planning a conference. I had placed this in the chat already in Berlin in November. So you can already pre-register for that. Even if you can't make it to Berlin, there will be a part that will be in person, partnering with Mondragon, looking at Jose Marie. And then there'll also be a global online conference where we will draw on many of you, I'm sure, to help us facilitate that. Mondragon and the New School are also starting our Platform Co-ops Now course again in August 30th, this time offered through the New School. And so we will also share these details very soon.
This is Ravi. Since we have a lot of people here who have experiences in academics and can speak better. Just had a generic question to you all. So when I talk to people and try to explain the idea of co-op, they always come up with this thing that this invisible hand of capitalism that should fix things, right? Like if people are not happy with the salary, they can move on to other jobs, and the supply will kind of drain out, and then the capitalists should be forced to increase their wages. Why that doesn't work? And if cooperatives are better, or worker cooperatives are definitely better than other forms of economics, why the evolution of businesses hasn't supported it in terms of numbers? How would you answer these two questions? I know, I mean, to me, to understand it, I can, but to explain it, put the words, I'm not so good, so I thought I'll ask it out here.
I have a very passionate response, but I'm going to not do this. I will wait for others to jump in so that I don't dominate this discussion. If somebody else wants to step to the front.
The question is, why is the cooperative not more dominant? Is that a question? Did I get that right? Sorry.
I know this. The question is like the invisible hand of supply and demand should pitch in, and if the workers are not getting wages, proper wages, the supply should go down of labor, and then you should have the wages go up. Why that invisible hand doesn't work?
Sorry. Okay.
It's a totally wrong assumption. That's why it's not working. The Smith was just looking at his society at his time, and this was one small side assumption he made. And now this is taken as an ideology for refilling the neoliberal idea. So that's all. That's why it isn't true. Point.
There's also much more, of course, we can say to that is, for one, even in your own country, right? I mean, just look at Amul, right, which has 3.9 million farmers as milk producers as part of it, right? As in its cooperative network. So I think a lot of cooperative size is also just simply that it is hidden in plain sight, right? And secondly, that there's a lot of value production going on that is not measured by GDP, right? So you can't capture that value that is created so easily in those hegemonic terms, right?
I think Adam Smith only made reference to the hidden hand only once. It's the one phrase that is recognized widely, but it was only referred to once in his text. But history has amplified it somewhat. On another topic, Professor Chomsky laid some emphasis on the cooperative commonwealth, and it's something I'm very keen on. And behind me, there's a picture from 1926 on the day of the general strike in the UK, but a very famous artist called Walter Crane had a picture, a representation of the cooperative commonwealth. And I think we need, I'll put a link in the chat, but I think we need to revive a kind of popular image, a common sense, an alternative common sense that provides a vision for a future outside of the neoliberal world. I'll do that now. Thanks.
I want to follow on Ian's commentary and go back to Jose Mari's question before Professor Chomsky. And one of the things that I take from this, from listening to Professor Chomsky, is his call for action. He mentioned we have just the window of opportunity. And one of the things that really struck me is the boldness with which he referred to things the way they are. And when he said, the system has been robbing us. He just say it with those words, and so we need to be as clear. And Trevor always asking, how do we escalate the benefits? I think we need to think big and to understand that we need to design a whole system. It's not just the cooperative, it's the whole economy and the whole governance of the world. And if we just open our eyes and say that this is the task we have to do, we have to develop the whole system. We have to design the whole system. I want to cite someone that I don't have his name from Prosocial in India, and he said that even if you design 2,000 mice, they don't add up to an elephant. We need to design the elephant and then go back and everyone does his own mice in its own place. But we need to design the elephant in order for that to happen. And I want to follow the call for action from Professor Chomsky. This is our opportunity. Either we take it or history will take care of us.
Can I add on to that, just because about this, maybe the mice and the elephant, just a metaphor as well, but just thinking about what was Professor Chomsky was talking about, because for me it was, when he was talking, it became very clear, like up till the mid-19th century, it was the commonsensical view. What we think as the radical was just the commonsensical view, and there's something happened that shifted power in some kind of way to down a different line. And no matter how much even if we had like, oh, the cooperative movement is, has got this proportion of GDP and is doing, if it hasn't got political, if we can't connect the two together, then it's not going, I don't know whether it's going to be sufficient to meet the crisis that we have. We have to marry these two things. And for me, the law is, it's got to be the, because I was thinking sometimes maybe you can have a mouse, which looks like a small thing, but can actually scare an elephant because the unintended consequence, like a Trojan horse, you bring some sort of legal instrument that looks quite anonymous and anodyne on the surface, but underneath when you enact it, it can have much larger consequences than may have been understood at the time. So that for me would be, around ownership as well, just something about ownership that Trevor was talking about, because something I was researching also about John Locke, around that time as well, the ideas of ownership, because we think of ownership as just one thing, oh, I own something exclusively, but there were different, in terms of land as well, there was a much more dominant idea of land ownership, which was about shared ownership. There was never an idea of one person exclusively owns and therefore can exclude everybody else. That was almost like a new idea that came about. And so this idea, just when we think about ownership and like the narratives we hold around scarcity and so on, the kind of these stories that we have to almost move away from and really be precise as well in what we mean when we think about things.
Okay, we are almost over an hour. It's about an hour that we went over our allotted time. I don't want to be overly German here, but I think probably some of you have other plans, so we can definitely go for another 10-15 minutes. But I think we should also be sort of considerate of everybody's plans. I think this is probably a discussion that we could continue. Just stay attuned. There will be another scholarly panel coming up very soon, in which we, in fact, some of the people on that panel are actually here right now as well. And so we can continue some of these discussions around scaling. I think the most important thing really seems to be, right, like how to actually really think very concretely about how to transport all of that to the digital economy, right? So how to really make sense of that, right? And find equivalents, also to maybe rethink some of these discussions that also Professor Chomsky referred to from 1900 Rosa Luxemburg, right? Maybe not all of that really applies to what's happening on, co-op cycle or up and go. So some of that may have to be rethought as well.
Yes, some of it may have to be rethought, and I think some of it can be sort of continued.
Right.
On that, I had just wanted to make a very quick plug for an initiative I'm starting now. I'd intended to do that with Chomsky, but I think it was better just to sort of get as much of Chomsky as possible. But Rudolf Rocker is somebody who I mentioned was very influential in Chomsky's life, and he sort of was an activist in the first place. He was an orphan, he was an autodidact, and for me, he embodies sort of the ideal of somebody who dedicates their life for the struggles of others, and sort of this idea of solidarity and mutual assistance. And these sorts of ideas, they don't die as long as there are, as long as it's organic life, which is sort of dependent on particular conditions. There will be, synergies, there will be symbiosis, there will be mutual aid. And so just if anyone is interested in this project, I'm starting a Rudolf Rocker Center, which is sort of dedicated to his life and works. If you don't know anything about him, I'm putting him in the chat. I have a QR code here with my contact information. We're in so you can just scan it with your phone and then get in touch with me. Even if you're just curious, let me know, and then we can talk. So there's that. All right.
All right. So let's. I think we should conclude this. To continue it another time. It's been fantastic. Again, thank you for sticking around for so long, and I think it was well worth it. And thank you for all your contributions.
Trevor, if I may, one sentence, just good news.
You are hijacking this, you're hijacking it.
Sorry,
okay.
sorry.
What's up?
Just I'm in the middle of elections day here, so I'm like in between. But since we're all here, so a bit of good news. We've been working for almost a decade now to change the law in Israel to allow us to start a credit union. And we've been vis-a-vis the regulator for, 3 years and 9 months. And last week, we've received a license for a credit union for the first time in Israel in 50 years. So.
Yeah. It's very nice. Yeah, we will speak next week on national Japanese television celebrating the creation of worker cooperatives in Japan as well. So there's definitely movement. All right, so unless somebody else wants to hijack this, I will absolutely push this to the end now and say, this is it, it's over. And we close this down now, and we see you again. Stay tuned. So on social media, right, you can follow us on Facebook or on Twitter. And yes, we are totally aware how contradictory it is to have a Facebook group for platform cooperativism. But it's still a good tool for us to come together in many ways. And so we continue these conversations. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao.
Thank you. Thanks.